In the 2nd century of the Common Era, beside the Tiber in Rome, workers were unloading round ceramic amphorae that had crossed the western Mediterranean from southern Spain. Each heavy jar carried olive oil. Painted marks recorded the container's weight, the oil inside, the merchant involved, and the officials who checked it. Once the oil had been emptied into storage, many of those thick jars were not sent back. They were broken, carried to a controlled dumping ground, and stacked shard upon shard. Over generations, the waste became a hill. Today it is called Monte Testaccio, an artificial mountain made largely from millions of discarded olive oil containers. That mountain is an invoice written in clay. It shows how much oil one enormous city demanded and how far an empire would reach to supply it. Romans ate olive oil, burned it in lamps, rubbed it onto skin, used it in religious practice, medicine, workshops, and public life. Oil from distant groves moved through farms, presses, rivers, ports, warehouses, tax systems, and state distribution. A fruit that is unpleasantly bitter when picked from the tree had become urban infrastructure. Now olive oil sits quietly in a supermarket bottle. It appears clean, simple, and almost timeless. But the liquid inside exists because humans solved a difficult biological problem, invested in trees that could take years to mature, and built systems capable of moving a fragile agricultural product across seas. Olive oil became sacred prize, household necessity, imperial cargo, colonial transplant, industrial brand, and frequent target for fraud. Its history is not only the story of Mediterranean food, it is the story of how people learned to turn fruit into portable light, and how that light created wealth while casting long shadows over land and labor. If you like stories where ordinary food turns into empire, trade, obsession, and hidden history, subscribe to Food Empire History. Now, to understand how olive oil became this powerful, we have to go back to where the story really begins. Long before Rome built a hill from broken jars, wild olive trees grew around parts of the Mediterranean. Their narrow leaves reflected harsh sunlight. Their roots survived in rocky ground where many crops struggled. Human communities gathered wild olives thousands of years before anyone created a specialized oil industry. Yet the olive offered no easy invitation. A fresh fruit taken directly from the branch can be intensely bitter because of compounds such as oleuropein. The flesh is thin compared with modern cultivated varieties, the stone is large, and the tree does not provide the immediate annual certainty of a field of grain. This is the first essential fact about olive oil. It was not discovered simply because someone enjoyed eating a wild olive. Its value had to be extracted. People had to crush the fruit, break its cells, gather the paste, and separate oil from water and solid matter. Archaeology along the Carmel coast in what is now Israel has revealed thousands of crushed olive stones and pulp at submerged settlements dating back roughly 7,000 years. Residues in pottery from the same broad region support the conclusion that late prehistoric communities were already processing olives for oil. At nearby Tel Saf in the Jordan Valley, charcoal evidence suggests people were cultivating olive and fig trees around 7,000 years ago, transporting useful trees beyond their natural woodland setting. There was probably no single inventor and no clean moment when the wild olive suddenly became domesticated. Genetic and archaeological research points instead to a long process centered strongly in the eastern Mediterranean, followed by repeated movement, selection, crossing, and local adaptation. People favored trees with more useful fruit, propagated successful specimens, protected seedlings, and learned where olives could survive. A seed produces variation, so growers who wanted a reliable tree increasingly depended on cuttings, grafting, and other forms of vegetative propagation. That choice gave olive culture one of its defining features. A valuable tree could be copied, but the copy still demanded patience. An olive grove was a promise made to the future. Grain might feed a household within a season. A young olive tree required years of care before it delivered a meaningful crop. It could then survive for generations, but harvests varied, weather mattered, and fruit had to be processed quickly if the oil was to remain fresh. This created a very different relationship between humans and land. Planting olives implied relative stability, access to property, accumulated knowledge, and confidence that someone would still be present when the trees matured. The grove stored labor across time. The breakthrough was mechanical but also social. Olives were crushed with stones, mortars, rollers, or mills until the fruit became paste. The paste could be kneaded so small droplets joined together, then pressed in baskets or mats. The resulting liquid was left to settle so oil could separate from water and sediment. Later cultures refined the equipment with beams, weights, screws, channels, settling tanks, and dedicated press rooms. The principle remained remarkably consistent: break the fruit, release the droplets, apply pressure or centrifugal force, and separate the lighter oil. This was more than a new flavor. Oil concentrated energy into a form that could be stored, poured, measured, traded, and burned. Grain required grinding and baking before it became bread. Wood produced smoke and ash when burned. Olive oil could move directly from storage jar to cooking pot, skin, altar, workshop, or lamp. It became liquid light, sunlight collected by leaves and released at night through a wick. By the Bronze Age, olive cultivation and oil production had become woven into the economies of the Eastern Mediterranean. Palaces and large settlements could collect oil, store it in bulk, perfume it with herbs and resins, and redistribute it. Written records from the Mycenaean world list oils and scented preparations as managed goods. Archaeological evidence from Crete and the Aegean shows increasing exploitation and production, though scholars remain careful about separating the gathering of wild fruit from deliberate cultivation and full agricultural specialization. Olive oil moved beyond nourishment because it touched the body and the sacred. It could preserve fragrance, carry medicinal ingredients, cleanse skin, condition hair, prepare the dead, anoint rulers, feed temple lamps, and mark offerings. In societies where artificial light was expensive, a vessel of oil controlled part of the night. In societies where scent and clean skin signaled refinement, perfumed oil became visible status. The same substance could appear in a laborer's meal and in a palace inventory, but not in the same quantity or quality. Ancient Greece made the olive into one of its most enduring cultural symbols. A famous Athenian tradition said that Athena won the city's patronage by giving it the olive tree. That story belongs to myth, not agricultural evidence, but it reveals what later Athenians believed the tree represented: permanence, civic identity, prosperity, and divine favor. Sacred groves were protected, olive branches carried symbolic power, and the tree became embedded in poetry, religion, and law. At the Panathenaic Games, victors did not merely receive a wreath or applause. From the 6th century before the Common Era, they could receive painted amphorae filled with oil from sacred Attic groves. Each standardized jar held roughly 38 to 40 liters. The number of jars varied by event, meaning a successful athlete could win a commodity with substantial market value. The prize fused sport, religion, state authority, art, and agriculture into a single object. On one side stood Athena. On the other appeared the contest. Inside was wealth that could be used, sold, or exported. Greek athletes also applied oil to their bodies before exercise. Oil helped turn the trained body into a public image of discipline and beauty, while the scraping of oil, sweat, and dust became part of gymnasium routine. At home, however, olive oil remained practical. It enriched grain, legumes, vegetables, and fish. It fed lamps and made plain food more satisfying. Its power came from this double identity. Olive oil could be sacred without ceasing to be useful, and useful without losing its prestige. As seafarers, settlers, merchants and farmers moved around the Mediterranean, they carried more than jars of finished oil. They carried cuttings, cultivation knowledge, press designs, and expectations about how civilized life should look. Phoenician and Greek networks helped spread olive culture westward, although local communities adopted, modified, and expanded it rather than merely receiving a finished package. The olive advanced slowly because living trees were harder to move than dried spices or metal. A cargo of oil could be sold after one voyage. A new grove required land, suitable climate, years of waiting, and workers who understood pruning and harvest. The amphora helped solve the movement problem. These ceramic containers could be shaped for particular products, sealed, stacked in ships, handled at docks, and identified by their forms and markings. Pottery was heavy and breakable, but clay was available, vessels were standardized, and the container protected valuable liquid from the chaos of transport. Ports connected groves to cities, roads and rivers connected inland estates to ports. Each new link widened the distance between the person who tended the tree and the person who consumed the oil. Rome inherited these Mediterranean systems and expanded them to imperial scale. Roman demand did not eliminate local production. Italy had its own groves, and oil also came from North Africa and the eastern provinces. But during the early empire, the province of Baetica in southern Spain became one of Rome's great supply zones. Its fertile river valleys supported extensive olive cultivation. Workshops along the Guadalquivir and its tributaries produced enormous numbers of thick, globular transport jars, now classified as Dressel 20 amphorae. Boats carried them downriver toward the coast. Seagoing vessels then moved the cargo toward Italy and military markets across the Western Empire. The system worked because every stage supported another. Groves needed mills and seasonal labor. Mills needed storage. Exporters needed jars. Jar makers needed clay and kilns. River transporters needed navigable routes. Merchants needed credit and information. The state needed inspectors, warehouses, and officials. Rome's political control, common legal frameworks, ports, roads, and suppression of piracy reduced some of the risks of long-distance exchange. Olive oil became scalable not because of one machine, but because an entire chain became predictable. Monte Testaccio is the surviving shape of that predictability. Most of its great mound consists of fragments from oil amphorae, especially vessels from Baetica. Painted inscriptions acted like ancient shipping records. They could identify empty and filled weights, merchants or transporters, places of export, inspection details, and officials. The jars were containers, receipts, and control devices at once. They made theft and substitution harder, and they allowed the state to monitor a commodity that mattered to both civilians and soldiers. This does not mean every Roman received unlimited oil from the government, or that every amphora on the hill belonged to a single centralized program. Rome's food supply mixed private commerce, taxation, state purchasing, distribution, and military provisioning. The exact balance changed over time. What the hill proves is scale. A city approaching 1 million inhabitants could not live on nearby gardens alone. Its appetites reorganized landscapes far beyond Italy. Olive oil helped bind province to capital. Landowners in Spain could profit from Roman demand. Merchants and shippers could build businesses around regular cargo. Potters and dock workers found work in the chain. Provincial elites gained connections to imperial markets. The army received familiar supplies at distant frontiers. Rome, meanwhile, converted political dominance into dependable access to food, fuel, and materials. Empire made oil easier to move, and moving oil helped make empire easier to maintain. But a smooth supply chain can hide the hands inside it. Olive harvest was concentrated, repetitive, and time-sensitive. Fruit had to be picked or beaten from branches, gathered from the ground, carried, cleaned, crushed, pressed, and stored before damage and fermentation reduced quality. Estates needed workers at precisely the moment the crop was ready. Across the Roman world, that labor could be performed by family farmers, tenants, hired workers, enslaved people, and mixed crews. The evidence does not support one universal plantation model, but slavery was integral to Roman society and present on many agricultural estates. Roman agricultural writers described farms in the language of management. They calculated land, equipment, animals, storage, and human labor as parts of a productive unit. Enslaved workers could be bought, assigned, disciplined, fed, clothed, and sold within the same economy that valued presses and trees. Olive oil did not create Roman slavery, and it would be misleading to imagine every grove filled with chained gangs. Yet the expansion of profitable agriculture occurred inside an empire powered by conquest, unequal landholding, taxation, and coerced labor. The clear oil in an urban lamp could begin in a countryside structured by profound differences in freedom and ownership. The tree also changed landscapes. Olive groves can protect soil when carefully managed, but expanding cultivation can replace mixed woodland, concentrate land, and increase pressure on water and labor. Terraces, walls, roads, mills, kilns, and ports reshaped whole regions. North African provinces developed major oil industries, leaving vast numbers of presses and transport vessels. These were not empty colonial spaces waiting for Roman knowledge. Local communities already possessed agricultural traditions. Imperial rule redirected production, taxation, settlement, and trade toward wider markets. When Western Roman authority fractured, olive culture did not disappear. Groves continued wherever climate, communities, and demand supported them. Byzantine towns, Islamic societies, Jewish communities, monasteries, villages, and trading cities kept oil in kitchens, lamps, workshops, medicine, and worship. Techniques changed unevenly. In some regions, production contracted. In others, it revived or expanded. The Mediterranean was never a single uninterrupted olive economy, but the tree's longevity allowed knowledge to survive political collapse better than many institutions did. In the Islamic Mediterranean and Al-Andalus, farmers and agronomists maintained and developed sophisticated knowledge of irrigation, grafting, soils, fruit preservation, and orchard management. Arabic influence remains visible even in Iberian vocabulary connected with oil and milling. Christian monasteries and estates also planted groves because oil served food, light, medicine, and liturgy. Control of an olive grove meant control of a resource that renewed itself if the trees and workers were maintained. European expansion then carried the olive beyond its old Mediterranean basin. Spanish colonists and missionaries planted olives in parts of the Americas. In California, Franciscan missions introduced the crop during the late 18th century, using oil for cooking and religious purposes. The trees traveled as part of a colonial package that attempted to reproduce European agriculture, diet, worship, and settlement. Their survival created the foundation for later commercial groves, but their arrival was inseparable from mission systems that transformed indigenous land and labor. For centuries, a mill from the Roman world would still have looked understandable to a later producer. Stones crushed fruit, mats held paste, beams, screws, animals or water-supplied force. Oil settled in tanks while water and solids separated. The decisive industrial changes came gradually. Metal machinery increased pressure. Hydraulic systems reduced the labor needed for pressing. Steam and later electric power made milling more regular. Railways, metal tanks, glass bottles, and larger commercial networks moved oil farther and presented it as a branded product rather than an anonymous local liquid. During the 20th century, centrifugal separation transformed large-scale production. Instead of relying mainly on stacks of fiber mats under a press, modern mills could wash olives, crush them into paste, mix that paste under controlled conditions, and send it through rapidly spinning equipment that separated oil from water and solids by density. Continuous systems increased throughput and reduced some contamination risks associated with old mats. The governing principle remained ancient, but speed and control changed the economics. Mechanization also changed the grove. Tractors, branch shakers, harvesting machines, pruning systems, irrigation, and high-density planting reduced dependence on large hand crews and made new regions commercially viable. Groves spread in Australia, the Americas, South Africa, and elsewhere. Yet the Mediterranean remained the center of production, culture, and trade. A food once closely tied to local harvest cycles became a global product expected to taste consistent in every season. The bottle changed the consumer's relationship with oil. Instead of knowing the grove, mill, harvest, and storage jar, buyers increasingly encountered categories and labels. Extra virgin olive oil is not simply a poetic phrase. It is a regulated grade based on chemical measurements and sensory assessment, produced mechanically without refining and required to remain within defined limits. Virgin oil permits a lower quality threshold. Oils with serious defects may be refined, removing unwanted characteristics but also much of the distinct aroma and flavor, then blended and sold under different categories. This classification created a new kind of power. Ancient inspectors painted weights and names onto amphorae. Modern regulators use laboratory analysis, trained tasting panels, traceability records, and legal definitions. Both systems exist for the same reason. Valuable oil invites deception. A seller can misstate origin, hide age, blend in lower-grade oil, falsely claim extra virgin quality, or use branding to make an ordinary product appear exceptional. Olive oil fraud is not a modern invention, but global supply chains create more places where identity can become blurred. Quality is also perishable. Olive oil does not improve indefinitely in a bottle. Light, heat, oxygen, time, damaged fruit, and delayed milling can flatten aroma and create defects. The image of oil as an eternal Mediterranean essence conflicts with its chemistry. The tree may live for centuries, but the best oil is fresh. The consumer sees permanence. The producer races against decay. The modern industry is enormous. In the current decade, the world consumes more than 3 million tons of olive oil in a typical year, and countries belonging to the International Olive Council account for the overwhelming majority of production. Spain remains the largest producer, but harvests swing sharply. A hot flowering period, prolonged drought, frost, heavy rain, pests, or alternate bearing can alter supply across the entire market. When production falls in one major region, prices rise thousands of kilometers away. The olive tree is famous for endurance, which can create a dangerous misunderstanding. Drought-tolerant does not mean drought-proof. The tree can survive conditions that reduce fruiting, while a farmer needs more than survival. Flowers must form, pollination must succeed, fruit must develop, and the tree must recover for another season. Recent research using thousands of years of pollen evidence warns that recurring drought and water stress threaten long-term production in important Mediterranean regions. Climate change is not merely shifting a culinary tradition. It is testing an agricultural system built around predictable winters, springs, and dry summers. Disease adds another pressure. The bacterium Xylella fastidiosa was detected in olive trees in southern Italy in 2013 and has since been found elsewhere in Europe. In affected parts of Apulia, millions of trees have died or been lost, altering landscapes, livelihoods, and cultural memory. There is no simple return to the old grove once a centuries-old tree is gone. Farmers respond with monitoring, removal, resistant varieties, new planting strategies, and research. But the damage shows how biological vulnerability can move through a connected world as efficiently as trade. Modern production therefore faces a choice. Intensive groves can deliver high yields and mechanized harvests, but they may demand irrigation, uniform varieties, and heavy capital. Traditional groves can preserve biodiversity, terraces, old trees, and rural culture, yet may struggle with costs and low returns. Neither category is automatically pure or destructive. The outcome depends on water, soil management, labor, scale, variety, and the market's willingness to pay for quality rather than only appearance. This returns us to the bottle. Tilt it over bread, vegetables, or a hot pan, and a narrow green-gold stream appears. That motion looks effortless. Behind it stands a fruit too bitter to eat raw, a tree that asks one generation to plant for another, and a technology old enough to survive the rise and fall of states. Behind it stand sacred Athenian prizes, Roman shipping records, enslaved and free rural workers, monasteries, mission orchards, hydraulic presses, centrifuges, laboratories, drought maps, and disease lines. Olive oil became powerful because it could cross boundaries without losing its usefulness. It moved from food to flame, from medicine to ritual, from grove to tax record, from imperial cargo to branded health symbol. It could nourish a household and enrich a landowner. It could illuminate a room while hiding the labor beyond the wick. It could last long enough to travel, yet remain fragile enough that freshness and trust still mattered. Monte Testaccio remains the perfect monument to that contradiction. Rome wanted so much olive oil that the empty containers became geography. The empire is gone, but the hill remains, a mountain built not from marble triumphs, but from packaging. It reminds us that ordinary consumption leaves structures behind: groves, roads, ports, laws, fortunes, waste, and memories. So the next time olive oil pools on a plate, it is worth seeing more than a cooking fat. It is liquid light, pressed from a stubborn fruit and carried through 7,000 years of human ambition. The history is not sealed outside the bottle. It pours out with every drop. If this story changed the way you see olive oil, subscribe for more hidden food histories.